They thought I would not notice the moment they began taking over my life. I remember thinking as I sat alone in the living room the day after my husband was buried, the house still filled with the quiet echo of people who had already left, the flowers arranged neatly on the table, the sympathy cards stacked in careful piles, everything appearing respectful and complete, as if the hardest part had already passed. But it had not, because what came after was never announced. It simply began. My son stood near the window, speaking softly into his phone, while my daughter-in-law moved through the kitchen, opening cabinets, as if she had always known where everything belonged. Their voices calm, their movements efficient, their presence steady in a way that might have looked supportive to anyone watching from the outside. But I was not watching from the outside. I was sitting right there, listening to the way decisions were made without being asked. "We should probably handle the bills for now," my son said, not to me, but near me, as if proximity was enough to include me in something that had already been decided. "It will be easier this way," my daughter-in-law added, her tone gentle but final, as she placed a folder on the counter. I did not respond. I did not ask what bills or why now or how long this arrangement was meant to last, because the answers were already clear, not in their words, but in the way those words were delivered. They were not asking, they were informing, and even that was done carefully, as if they believed I needed things explained in smaller pieces. "You should rest," she said, turning toward me with a soft expression that did not quite reach her eyes. "You have been through a lot." I nodded slowly, not because I agreed, but because it allowed the moment to pass without interruption, and that mattered more than anything else right now, because what they saw as weakness I understood as opportunity. One watched as my son picked up a stack of papers from the table, glancing through them quickly before placing them back down in a slightly different order, as if organizing something he had only just begun to understand, and I noticed how naturally they moved through the house, adjusting small things, shifting objects, changing routines, not dramatically, not in a way that would draw attention, but enough to establish a new rhythm, one that did not require my input. And that was the detail they thought I would miss, the shift, not in action, but in control. I leaned back slightly in the chair, my hands resting calmly in my lap, my expression unchanged, because reacting now would only confirm what they already believed, that I was overwhelmed, that I needed guidance, that I would accept whatever was decided for me without question. And that belief was not something I intended to correct, not yet, because the truth is I had been preparing for this long before that day, long before the hospital visits and the quiet conversations and the slow realization that my husband would not be coming home. I had listened then too. I had paid attention to every detail, every account, every document, every condition that had been carefully put into place, not out of fear, but out of understanding, because life does not ask for permission before it changes, and neither do people when they believe they have been given an opening. I watched them continue moving through the house, speaking in low voices, making small adjustments that felt temporary to them, but permanent in intention, and I allowed it all to unfold without interruption, because this was not the moment to remind them of what I knew. This was the moment to let them believe what they needed to believe. And as I sat there in the same chair where I had spent so many years beside my husband, listening to the quiet certainty in their voices, I realized something simple but absolute. They thought I had been left alone, but what they did not understand was that I had never been unprepared. I did not question them that day, and I did not question them the next day either, not because I was unsure of what they were doing, but because I had already seen enough to understand the direction. Everything was moving in the house no longer felt like it belonged entirely to me, even though nothing had physically changed. The same furniture, the same photographs, the same quiet corners where memories still lingered, but the way it was being used had shifted in a way that did not require permission. It only required assumption. My son began arriving earlier than usual, letting himself in without knocking, his key already in hand, as if it had always been there, while my daughter-in-law started bringing over groceries, organizing them in the kitchen in a system that made sense to her, not to me. Labels turned outward, containers replaced, shelves adjusted, everything done efficiently, with a calm confidence that suggested permanence rather than temporary help. "This will make things easier for you," she said one morning as she rearranged the pantry, placing items higher and lower without asking if I could reach them comfortably. I watched from the doorway, my hands resting lightly at my sides, not interrupting, not correcting, simply observing, because each small change carried meaning beyond the action itself. It was not about groceries or schedules, it was about control presented as care, and that distinction was something they believed I would not notice. "You do not have to worry about anything anymore," My son added later that afternoon, sitting across from me at the table with a tone that sounded reassuring on the surface, but final underneath, as if worry was something that had already been removed from my responsibility. Without my consent, I nodded again, the same quiet acknowledgement I had given before, allowing the conversation to move forward without resistance, because resistance would only confirm what they already believed, that I was overwhelmed, that I needed guidance, that I would accept whatever was decided for me, and that belief worked in my favor more than they realized. I stood up after he left the room and walked slowly through the house, pausing in small places, not out of confusion, but out of recognition. The hallway where the light shifted in the late afternoon, the kitchen counter where the folder had been placed, the chair where I had sat the day before, everything still in place, yet carrying a different meaning now, because I could see the pattern forming more clearly with each passing hour. They were not waiting for me to adjust, they were adjusting everything around me. Instead, I stepped into the bedroom and closed the door quietly behind me, moving toward the desk where the drawer remained untouched exactly as I had left it. I opened it slowly and looked inside, not searching, not verifying, simply acknowledging the presence of something that had already been prepared long before any of this had begun. Documents, neatly arranged, details, carefully outlined, conditions set not in reaction, but in anticipation. I rested my hand lightly on the edge of the drawer for a moment longer than necessary, because this was not hesitation, this was confirmation. Everything I needed was already there, not something I had to create, not something I had to rush into action, just something waiting for the right moment. And that moment had not yet arrived. I closed the drawer gently and turned back toward the door, opening it without sound, stepping once again into the space that now felt different, not because I had lost control, but because they believed I had, and belief, when left unchallenged, has a way of revealing far more than any question ever could. I walked back into the living room where my daughter-in-law was adjusting the curtains, allowing more light into the room, without asking if I preferred it that way, and I watched her for a moment, not with frustration, not with anger, but with understanding, because what she saw as improvement I recognized as assumption, and assumptions are always built on something incomplete. "That looks nice," I said calmly, my voice steady, my expression unchanged, and she smiled briefly, satisfied with the adjustment, unaware that what she had just changed was not the light in the room, but the clarity of the situation. As I sat down once more in the same chair and let the quiet settle around us, I realized something with complete certainty. They were not taking control because they needed to, they were taking control because they believed I no longer could, and that belief was the one thing I had no intention of correcting. Not yet. I began to notice the changes, not in what they said, but in what they stopped asking for. The next few days followed the same quiet pattern, my son arriving with purpose, my daughter-in-law moving through the house as if she had already memorized every corner, every drawer, every small detail that once belonged only to me, and I let it continue without interruption, because interruption would only shift their behavior, not reveal it. And what I needed was not adjustment, it was clarity. One afternoon I sat at the kitchen table while she sorted through a stack of mail, placing certain envelopes to the side, opening others without hesitation, her movements smooth, practiced, as if this responsibility had already been handed over in her mind. "These are just statements, nothing important," she said without looking at me, her tone casual, almost reassuring, and I nodded slowly, not because I agreed, but because I was listening more to what she did than what she said, because what she considered unimportant had once been part of decisions I made every month, without assistance, without confusion, without explanation, and now those same decisions were being filtered before they ever reached me. I watched as she placed one envelope aside, slightly separate from the others, her fingers pausing just long enough to draw attention to it before continuing with the rest. And in that small hesitation, I saw something more than routine. I saw selection, I saw control, and I understood exactly what that meant. My son entered the room shortly after, glancing at the table before looking at me with a softened expression. "We are just trying to make things easier for you," he said, again repeating the same line as if consistency would make it more believable, and I met his gaze calmly, not challenging, not agreeing, simply holding it long enough for him to shift slightly in his chair, because certainty, when it is not returned, has a way of creating its own discomfort. I stood up then and walked toward the counter, picking up a glass of water, not because I needed it, but because movement creates space, and space allows observation without pressure. "Of course," I said quietly, my voice, even my expression, unchanged. and they both seemed to relax slightly, as if my acceptance had confirmed something for them, something they had already decided was true, and that was the moment I recognized the pattern completely, not just in their actions, but in their expectations. They believed that silence meant agreement, that stillness meant surrender, that lack of resistance meant lack of awareness, and that belief was what allowed everything else to continue without question. I carried the glass back to the table and sat down again, placing it carefully in front of me, before looking at the remaining stack of mail, not reaching for it, not asking for it, simply acknowledging its presence, because the details were no longer hidden, they were simply being overlooked by the people who thought they were controlling them. I let the moment pass without further comment, allowing the room to return to its quiet rhythm before standing once more and walking toward the hallway, the same path I had taken before, the same steady pace, the same calm presence that had not changed despite everything that had shifted around me. I entered the bedroom and closed the door behind me, moving toward the desk, once again opening the drawer with the same measured motion as before, the documents inside exactly where they had been left, untouched, unchanged, waiting not for action, but for timing. I traced my fingers lightly over the edge of one page, not reading it, not needing to, because I already knew what it contained: provisions, conditions, structures designed not in response to weakness, but in anticipation of moments like this, moments where perception and reality no longer aligned. I closed the drawer again and stood there for a moment longer, not thinking, not questioning, just confirming, because everything I needed to understand had already been revealed, not through confrontation, but through repetition, through small, consistent actions that built a pattern impossible to ignore. And as I turned back toward the door and stepped once again into the hallway, I realized something with complete clarity. They were not hiding what they were doing, they were simply assuming I could not see it, and that assumption was the one thing that would change everything. When the time came, the following days did not bring any confrontation, and that was exactly what made everything clearer, because when people believe they are in control, they do not rush, they settle into it, they repeat their behavior with more confidence, with less hesitation, and that is when patterns become undeniable. I noticed how my son stopped explaining things altogether, no longer offering reasons, no longer framing decisions as temporary. Instead, he began speaking in statements, short, direct, and final. I will take care of this, or we already handled that, as if the process itself had been completed before I was even aware of it. And my daughter-in-law moved with even greater ease through the house, adjusting schedules, changing small routines, deciding what was necessary and what was not, without ever pausing to ask if those decisions were hers to make. I watched it all without interruption, not because I felt powerless, but because I understood something they did not: that control built on assumption always reveals itself over time, and once it does, it becomes easier to define than anything that is hidden. One afternoon, I stood near the doorway of the living room as they spoke quietly at the table, their voices low, but not low enough to disappear completely. She does not really keep track of these things anymore, my daughter-in-law said, her tone measured, not harsh, just certain, and my son nodded in agreement, not questioning, not correcting, simply accepting the statement as fact. And that moment did not bring anger or even surprise, it brought confirmation, because what they believed had now been spoken out loud, and once something is said, it no longer exists only in thought, it becomes part of the structure they are building around you. I stepped into the room, then not suddenly, not loudly, just enough for them to notice my presence without disrupting their conversation. Do you need anything? My son asked, turning toward me with that same softened tone that had become familiar over the past few days, and I shook my head gently. No, I am fine, I replied, my voice steady, my expression unchanged, and they both returned to what they were doing almost immediately, as if my answer had confirmed their assumption that I was no longer involved in the details that once required my full attention. I moved past them slowly toward the window, resting my hand lightly on the edge of the frame. As I looked outside, the same street, the same quiet movement of the afternoon, nothing outwardly different yet. Everything internally had shifted, because now I could see not just what they were doing, but why they believed they could do it. They had already placed me in a position in their minds, a position where I was no longer managing, no longer deciding, no longer aware, and that belief had given them permission to move forward without hesitation. I turned away from the window and walked back through the hallway, my steps calm, measured, unchanged, as I entered the bedroom, once more closing the door behind me. With the same quiet motion as before, the room remained exactly as I had left it, untouched by the adjustments happening in the rest of the house. And that contrast mattered because it reminded me that not everything had shifted, only what they believed they controlled. I walked to the desk and opened the drawer again, the documents inside still in perfect order, still waiting not for reaction, but for timing, and I allowed myself to look at them more closely this time, not because I needed to review them, but because I wanted to acknowledge the full structure that had been put in place, every condition, every provision, every detail designed with intention, not urgency. And I traced the edge of one page lightly with my fingers before closing the drawer again, because the preparation was complete. Nothing needed to be added, nothing needed to be changed, only one thing remained. And that was the moment when belief and reality would no longer align. I stood there for a moment longer, my hand resting on the surface of the desk as I let that understanding settle fully into place. And when I finally turned toward the door and stepped back into the hallway, I realized something with absolute clarity. They had already decided who I was in this situation, but they had not yet seen who I had always been. And when that moment came, it would not require explanation, it would not require argument, it would only require the truth to stand exactly where it had always been, waiting. I did not need more time to understand what they were doing, but I allowed more time anyway, because time reveals things that intention tries to hide. And over the next few days, the pattern became even more defined. My son stopped bringing documents to the table altogether, instead keeping them in his own bag or discussing them quietly with my daughter-in-law in the other room, their voices low, their decisions already made before I ever had the chance to be included. And that exclusion was no longer subtle. It was structured, it was consistent, it was intentional. One afternoon, I walked into the kitchen and found her standing at the counter with a set of papers spread out in front of her, her posture relaxed, her movements confident as she sorted through them without hesitation. She glanced up briefly when she noticed me, then offered a small, polite smile before continuing, as if my presence required acknowledgement, but not involvement. "We are just organizing things so you do not have to worry about them," she said, her tone calm, her words carefully chosen, and I nodded once again, not correcting, not questioning, simply allowing the statement to exist exactly as it was, because what she called organizing I recognized as filtering, and what she called helping I understood as controlling. I stepped closer to the counter, not reaching for the papers, not asking to see them, just observing the way her hand moved one document slightly aside, as if deciding its relevance without consultation. And in that moment, something became completely clear. They were no longer waiting for permission. They had replaced it with assumption, and assumption, when repeated often enough, becomes belief. And belief, when left unchallenged, becomes action. I turned away from the counter and walked slowly into the living room where my son was seated reviewing something on his phone. His expression focused, his posture slightly forward, as if engaged in something that required attention, but not discussion. "Everything all right?" he asked without looking up, and I paused for just a moment before answering, not because I needed time, but because I wanted to choose the exact tone that would carry no resistance. "Yes, everything is fine," I said quietly, and that was all he needed to hear, because agreement, even when it is not real, has a way of confirming what people already want to believe. I sat down in the same chair once again, my hands resting lightly in my lap, my gaze steady, not fixed on anything in particular, because the details were no longer hidden. They were simply unfolding in front of me exactly as they had been set in motion by their own actions. I thought briefly about the earlier conversations, the ones that had been framed as temporary, as supportive, as necessary, and how quickly those words had shifted into something else, something more permanent, something less transparent. And I realized that the shift had not happened all at once. It had happened gradually, through repetition, through small decisions made without question, through silence that was mistaken for agreement. I stood up again after a few minutes and walked back down the hallway, entering the bedroom with the same calm presence I had maintained throughout, closing the door behind me and moving directly toward the desk. The drawer opened easily, the documents inside still perfectly aligned, still unchanged, still waiting, and this time I did not hesitate at all. I selected a single folder from the stack and placed it on the desk, opening it with a steady hand, the contents familiar, every page, every line, every condition already understood, because this was not something new, this was something that had been prepared long before any of this began. I reviewed one section carefully, not to learn, but to confirm the trigger, the condition that would shift everything from assumption to consequence, and it was there exactly where I knew it would be, clearly defined, not open to interpretation, not dependent on emotion, just a structure waiting to be activated. I closed the folder slowly, and placed it back into the drawer, but not in the same position as before. This time it sat slightly forward, not hidden, not tucked away, but ready. I rested my hand on the desk for a moment longer than necessary, not because I felt uncertain, but because I recognized the weight of what would come next. This was no longer about observation. This was about transition from watching to acting, and as I turned toward the door and stepped back into the hallway once again, I realized something with complete certainty. They believed they had already taken control, but what they had actually done was create the exact conditions required for me to take it back, and when that moment arrived, it would not be loud, it would not be sudden, it would simply be undeniable. I did not act immediately after that realization, because action taken too early often reveals more than it resolves, and what I needed now was precision, not speed. The house remained quiet, but no longer neutral. Every movement, every decision, every quiet conversation carried weight, not because it was new, but because I now understood exactly where it led. My son continued managing things without asking, no longer even mentioning the details in my presence, while my daughter-in-law moved through the house with a sense of ownership that had fully settled into place. She adjusted schedules, coordinated calls, rearranged small spaces, as if permanence had already been established, and I allowed it all to continue, because interruption at this stage would only shift their behavior, not expose it, and what I needed was not adjustment, it was confirmation, the final piece that would move everything from assumption to consequence. It came sooner than expected. One afternoon, I walked into the living room and found them both seated at the table, a set of documents spread out in front of them, their voices low, but focused, not casual, not temporary, something more deliberate, something that required agreement rather than suggestion. I paused just outside the doorway, not hiding, not announcing my presence, simply allowing the moment to continue without influence. If we move this now, it will be easier later. My son said, his tone firm, measured, as if discussing something already within his authority. My daughter-in-law nodded, tracing a line across one of the pages with her finger. She will not understand all of this anyway. It is better if we handle it now, she replied, and that sentence did not bring surprise, it brought clarity, because in that moment everything aligned, not just their actions, but their belief, fully expressed, without hesitation, without disguise. They had crossed the line from helping into deciding, from supporting into replacing, and that was the condition I had been waiting for, not spoken to me, not directed at me, but spoken in a way that revealed exactly how they saw me now. I stepped forward, then just enough for the floor to shift slightly beneath my weight, and both of them looked up at the same time, their expressions changing, not dramatically, but enough to register awareness. Is everything all right? I asked calmly, my voice, even my posture, relaxed, and they both paused for a brief second before my son answered, "Yes, we are just going over some things, nothing you need to worry about." And there it was again, the same language, the same structure, the same assumption repeated without hesitation, and I nodded once more, not challenging, not questioning, simply accepting the statement exactly as it was, because that acceptance was the final confirmation I needed. I turned away from the table without another word and walked back down the hallway, my steps steady, my pace unchanged, because there was no urgency, now only sequence. I entered the bedroom and closed the door behind me, moving directly to the desk, opening the drawer without hesitation, and taking out the folder that had remained ready all along. I placed it on the surface in front of me and opened it carefully, turning to the section I had already identified. The condition clearly outlined, the language precise, not open to interpretation, and for the first time, I did not simply observe it, I acted. I reached for the phone beside me and dialed the number I already knew by memory, not looking it up, not second-guessing the decision, because this was not a reaction, this was execution. "Hello." The voice on the other end answered, calm, professional, and familiar. "It is time," I said simply, not adding explanation, not needing to clarify, because everything that needed to be understood had already been documented long before this moment. "Understood." The voice replied without pause, and the line went quiet again. I placed the phone back on the desk and closed the folder, gently resting my hand on top of it for a brief moment, because this was not hesitation, this was completion. The transition had been made, the plan that had once been preparation was now in motion, and nothing further was required from me. I stood up and closed the drawer, placing everything back exactly where it belonged before turning toward the door once more. As I stepped into the hallway, the house felt the same as it had minutes before, the same light, the same quiet, the same movement in the distance. But something fundamental had shifted, not in the space, but in the structure. And as I walked back toward the living room, where they still sat unaware of what had just been set in motion, I realized something with complete certainty. They believed they had reached the point where control was theirs, but what they had actually reached was the point where it would be taken back, without argument, without warning, and without the need for anything more than what had already been prepared all along. The next morning did not arrive with noise or urgency. It arrived the same way every other morning had arrived: quiet, steady, predictable. And that was what made the shift so precise, because nothing on the surface demanded attention, yet everything beneath it had already begun to move. I prepared my coffee, as usual, standing at the counter for a moment longer than necessary, allowing the rhythm of the morning to remain unchanged, because change, when done correctly, does not announce itself. It settles in without resistance. My son arrived shortly after, letting himself in with the same ease as before, his steps familiar, his presence expected. But there was something different this time, not in what he did, but in what followed. He paused briefly near the doorway, as if sensing something he could not yet define, before continuing into the living room where my daughter-in-law was already seated, her phone in hand, her posture relaxed, yet focused. "Did you check that yesterday?" she asked without looking up, and he shook his head slightly. "I will take care of it today. It should not be a problem," he replied, his tone confident, the same confidence that had grown steadily over the past days, built on repetition, built on belief. And I listened from the kitchen, not hiding, not revealing, simply present, as always, because presence without interference has a way of revealing more than direct questions ever could. I carried my coffee into the living room and sat down in the same chair, placing the cup carefully on the table beside me, and neither of them looked up immediately, not out of disrespect, but out of assumption. They had already decided that my presence did not require adjustment, and that was the moment the first sign appeared, not loud, not dramatic, just subtle enough to be almost overlooked. My son reached for his phone, glancing at the screen, and his expression shifted slightly, not confusion, not concern, just a pause longer than expected before he tapped the screen again, as if confirming what he was seeing. "That is strange," he said, quietly, more to himself than to anyone else, and my daughter-in-law looked up, then her attention drawn by the tone rather than the words. "What is it?" she asked, and he hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. "It looks like access has been restricted on one of the accounts I was reviewing yesterday." His voice steady but slower now, as if each word required more thought than before, and I remained exactly where I was, my posture unchanged, my expression neutral, because this was not a moment for reaction. This was a moment for observation. The structure had begun to respond, not in a way that demanded attention, but in a way that required recognition. My daughter-in-law sat up slightly, placing her phone down as she reached for the papers on the table, flipping through them quickly, her movements no longer as fluid as they had been the day before. "That does not make sense. Everything was fine yesterday," she said, her tone controlled, but no longer certain, and my son nodded again, looking back at his phone. "Maybe it is just a temporary issue. I will check again later," he replied, attempting to restore the confidence that had guided them until now. But something had already shifted, something small, but irreversible, and I could see it in the way they both moved, slightly more carefully, slightly more aware, not of me, but of the situation itself. I lifted my cup and took a slow sip of coffee, the warmth steady, familiar, grounding, because everything that was happening now was not unexpected. It was the natural continuation of what had already been set in motion long before this moment, long before the conversations, long before the assumptions. They had built their confidence on the belief that nothing would change, and now that belief had been quietly interrupted, not challenged, not confronted, simply adjusted. And as I set the cup back down on the table and looked toward the window, allowing the morning light to settle into the room, I realized something with complete clarity. They had begun to notice not everything, not yet, but enough to understand that something was no longer aligned with what they expected. And once that awareness begins, it does not stop, it expands, it connects, it reveals. And they would follow that realization step by step, not because I guided them, but because the structure itself would lead them there, without the need for explanation, without the need for confrontation, and without the need for anything more than what had already been prepared all along. By the afternoon, the shift had already begun to take shape, not in a way that demanded attention, but in a way that could no longer be ignored. My son had moved from casual checking to repeated attempts, his phone now rarely leaving his hand, while my daughter-in-law sat beside him, reviewing the same documents again and again, her movements no longer smooth, but measured, each page turned with more intention than before. "Try it again," she said quietly, her voice controlled, but carrying a slight edge that had not been there before, and he did exactly that, tapping the screen, waiting, watching, then shaking his head just slightly. It is not just one account, it looks like everything is connected to a different authorization now, he replied, and that sentence lingered in the room longer than anything they had said earlier, because it was not an assumption, it was an observation, and observations are harder to dismiss. I remained seated in the same chair, my posture relaxed, my hands resting lightly in my lap, as I listened, not to interrupt, but to allow the realization to continue forming without resistance, because once awareness begins, it moves on its own. It does not need guidance, it only needs space. My daughter-in-law leaned back slightly, her eyes narrowing just enough to show that she was no longer certain. That does not just happen on its own, she said more quietly now, as if speaking the thought out loud might confirm something she was not ready to accept, and my son did not respond immediately this time. Instead, he placed his phone down on the table and looked at the papers in front of him, not reading them, but reconsidering them, as if they no longer held the same meaning they had the day before. And that was the second shift, not in access, but in perception. What they had once believed was stable was now being questioned, not by me, but by the structure itself. I stood up slowly and walked toward the window. Not because I needed to move, but because stillness in one place can sometimes draw attention, and attention was not necessary here. Not yet. The light outside had softened slightly, the afternoon settling into that quiet space, where everything appears unchanged yet feels different, and I rested my hand lightly against the frame, looking out for just a moment before turning back toward the room. They were still seated at the table, but no longer in the same way, their posture more upright, their focus more contained, their conversation quieter, not because they were hiding it, but because they were now considering it. We should probably call someone to check this, my son said finally, his voice steady, but no longer confident, and my daughter-in-law nodded without hesitation. Yes, there has to be an explanation, she replied, and there was a brief pause after that, not empty, but filled with the weight of something they had not yet fully understood. I walked back toward my chair and sat down again, with the same calm presence I had maintained from the beginning, not offering input, not asking questions, simply existing within the moment as it unfolded, because involvement now would only disrupt what was already in motion, and this was not a process that required my direction, it required their realization. My son reached for his phone again, this time dialing a number rather than checking a screen, his voice lowering as he began to speak, explaining what he was seeing, asking questions, waiting for answers that would not align with what he expected, and I could hear it in the pauses and the way his tone shifted slightly as each response came back to him, not with urgency, but with clarity. My daughter-in-law watched him closely, her expression focused, but no longer controlled in the same way as before, and when he finally ended the call, he did not speak immediately. He simply looked at the table for a moment longer than necessary before saying, "They said the authorization structure was changed recently, and that it follows a pre-existing directive." And that sentence settled into the room with a quiet finality, because it did not suggest error, it suggested intention, and intention is something that cannot be undone by simply questioning it. My daughter-in-law sat back slowly, her hands resting on the table, her fingers still. For the first time since I had seen her in this space. "A directive from who?" she asked, and my son did not answer right away, because the answer was already there, not in front of him, not in the documents, not in the system, but in the one thing they had not yet fully considered. And as I sat there watching the light continue to shift across the room and the silence settle into something more defined, I realized something with complete certainty. They were no longer trying to manage the situation, they were trying to understand it. And once that shift happens, everything that follows is no longer under their control. It is simply the result of what has already been set in motion long before they ever believed they had a place within it. I did not need to say anything after that, because the room had already shifted into a space where silence carried more meaning than explanation. My son remained seated at the table, his eyes fixed on the documents in front of him, but no longer reading them. The confidence that had once guided his actions now replaced by something quieter, something more uncertain, while my daughter-in-law sat beside him, her posture still composed, but no longer relaxed, her hands resting on the table, without movement, as if any sudden action might disrupt what was already unfolding. Between them, I remained in my chair, near the window, the same place I had been from the beginning, my posture unchanged, my presence steady, not distant, not involved, simply there. As everything settled into its final form, the light outside had softened further, moving slowly across the room, casting long shadows that made the familiar space feel more defined, more deliberate, as if every detail had been waiting for this moment to be seen clearly. They said it was already in place before we even started handling anything. My son said finally, his voice lower, now not searching for confirmation, but acknowledging what had already been confirmed, and my daughter-in-law did not respond immediately. She simply looked at the table, her expression focused not on the documents, but on the realization forming behind them, because this was no longer about access or accounts. It was about understanding the structure they had stepped into without knowing it existed. I stood up slowly, not to interrupt, but because the moment had reached its natural conclusion, and movement now would not change anything. It would only mark the transition from what had been assumed to what had been understood. I walked toward the kitchen, taking my time, not because I needed distance, but because distance allows realization to complete itself without interference. I poured another cup of coffee, the motion simple, familiar, grounding in a way that required no thought. And as I stood there for a brief moment, I could hear them behind me, not speaking, not moving, just sitting with the weight of what had been revealed. Without being explained, I returned to the living room and placed the cup on the table beside my chair before sitting down again. The same calm posture, the same steady presence, and this time they both looked at me, not quickly, not dramatically, but with a different awareness, one that had not been there before. Not suspicion, not accusation, just recognition. My son opened his mouth slightly, as if to speak, then paused, closing it again, because whatever he might have said no longer carried the same certainty it would have held before. And my daughter-in-law shifted slightly in her seat, her gaze steady, but no longer directed past me as it had been in the previous days. This was the final shift, not in control, but in perception. They were no longer moving around me. They were now aware of me within the structure they had tried to redefine. We did not realize. My son began, his voice measured, careful, as if choosing each word carried weight, and I nodded gently, not to agree, not to correct, but to acknowledge that realization had arrived in its own time, without being forced, without being explained. It was always there. I replied quietly, my tone, even my expression, unchanged. And that was all that needed to be said, because anything more would have reduced the moment to explanation, and explanation was no longer necessary. They had seen enough, they had understood enough, and what remained was not something that could be negotiated or undone. It simply existed exactly as it had been designed to exist from the very beginning. I lifted my cup and took a slow sip, the warmth steady, familiar, as the silence settled. Once more, not uncomfortable, not uncertain, just complete. And as I looked toward the window, allowing the last of the evening light to fill the room, I realized something with absolute clarity. They had believed I was weak because I had not resisted. They had believed I was alone because I had not asked for help. But what they had never considered was that strength does not always speak, and preparation does not always reveal itself until the moment it is needed. And now that moment had passed, not with confrontation, not with argument, but with understanding. And once that understanding is reached, there is nothing left to prove, nothing left to take back. Only one thing remains: the truth, standing exactly where it has always been, waiting.